Good afternoon. My name's Ellen Richey, and I'm the Chief Risk Officer at Visa Inc., and we're here today to talk about the economic dimension of cybersecurity. And I would like to first introduce my fellow panelists. To my immediate left, we have Bob Campbell, former Vice Chairman at Deloitte and a member of the EastWest Institute Board of Directors. Immediately next to him, Ron O'Hanley. He's President of Asset Management and Corporate Services at Fidelity Investments. And next to him, we do not have Roberta Stampley. Instead, we have a late addition whose name is Bruce. I've forgotten your last name.
I thank you, Ellen. I'm Bruce McConnell. Some of you may remember me from this morning. I'll tell her you said that.
Bruce is, of course, as I guess most of you know, a Senior Vice President at the EastWest Institute and former
Deputy Undersecretary
of Homeland Security. Welcome, Bruce.
Thank you.
And thank you for agreeing to join us 5 minutes ago. And lastly, we have Phil Venables, who is the Chief Information Risk Officer at Goldman Sachs. Thank you, Phil. Now, as I was looking at the program, and I saw that this panel was introduced as follows: economic growth and stability are now highly correlated with cybersecurity as a statement of fact. And I started to think to myself, well, is that really true? Is economic growth and stability really highly correlated with cybersecurity? And the reason I was questioning it is that this issue of cybersecurity has been a big issue in my industry, the payments industry, for at least 10 years. And although, and I am mindful of the numbers that were just flashing up there, there's a lot of money being stolen, it doesn't seem to be much more at the moment over this period of time than a kind of cost of doing business, like pilferage in the retail industry, something that has been managed to a level that is a kind of an economic cost of doing business. So is economic growth really correlated with cybersecurity in that sense? Probably not. So what are we really talking about? What has changed? And as I reflected on that, it occurred to me probably two things. The first is just the size of the problem. So we used to have smaller scale, but now we have highly concentrated organized crime, still economically motivated, but the numbers have gone up exponentially. So we're talking about, in the payments industry, numbers that begin with a B, billions of dollars. And then looking at retail banking and other industries where hacking is enabling people to steal credentials and access financial resources, multiple billions of dollars being stolen. And where is that money going? It is feeding other types of illicit activity, organized crime, and that sort of thing. That's one thing that's changed, and it feeds on itself. Because the more money they have, the more sophisticated resources they can deploy, and the more sophisticated hacking that can take place and so forth. So you have a vicious circle there. But then the second thing I think is probably more important and probably more relevant to what we've been talking about so far at this summit, which is the emergence of malicious actors whose goal is not economic, but whose goal is disruption and destruction. And so we're talking here, it could be nation states. It could be that we in the private sector have become targets in some kind of military warfare activity, and we are now expected to defend ourselves against. Or extra-state actors beyond the control of any government whose goal is similarly destruction and malicious activity. Now, this isn't something so far that we've seen materialize to such an extent that it has significantly disrupted economic activity, but it could. It could. So in my mind, I started to think that's what's changed. But this panel is not about me, it's about all of you. So in light of the situation, I'd like to start by asking our distinguished panelists, how are boards seeing this question? Are they seeing cyber as a top-tier issue these days? And what is the appropriate role of a board in debating what, up until recently, would have been considered a very, very technical engineering type of issue?
I'll be glad to address it. Yeah, Ellen, thank you, and appreciate your provocative introductory comments. Let me comment on your comments, and then I'll comment on your question. When we took on the issue of cybersecurity at the EastWest Institute several years ago, took it on in part out of the recognition of the potential impact of major cyber events on business continuity and economic security. I mean, you may be correct, we haven't had one to that degree yet, but certainly it's on the mind of a number of business leaders with whom we confer, and it's on their mind because of the broader potential impact on corporate brand, on the litigation environment, on customer retention, and some big broader issues beyond just short-term financial losses, not to trivialize those. I guess back to your question, I think for those reasons, I am seeing and we are seeing a significant increased focus in the corporate boardroom on cybersecurity and a number of leading corporate concerns adopting much more of an enterprise-wide approach to cyber risk assessment, cyber risk mitigation planning in the context of broader organizational board-level risk review activities. And those obviously go way beyond what used to be the purview of the CIO and, in my view, touch virtually everything. I mean, it affects our governance processes, our policies and procedures, our human capital strategies, our technology investment strategies, our supply chain strategies. So it's, I mean, the impact of cyber pervasive corporately, the level of prospective risk significant, which I think properly warrants very much an enterprise approach. But with that said, I know we've got a couple of colleagues on the panel who are actually living it as executives in the industry.
I'd comment first that if something touches everything, it's hard to talk about it specifically about anything. So maybe, well, maybe one of you could help me out on that one.
I would agree with Bob, and the way I would, maybe to illustrate it, where was it and where does it seem to be going? When boards first started talking about this, they basically didn't. I mean, it got reported to boards in the same place that, you know, a security issue would. It started out as a security issue, literally security, right next to, you know, branch robberies and things like that. It then moved into a technology issue, and I think what's changed is a recognition that this is a business risk issue. You know, having said that, I'm not so sure that the risk frameworks that are in place have matured to recognize that like it has for other risks, but I think what's happened in most boardrooms now is that it's being viewed as a business risk like any other major risk within the business, and therefore is being managed that way. As a consequence, it's no longer simply the purview of the security department or IT. It's part of the day-to-day business, and an expectation that the business leaders are in fact thinking about these risks as they're thinking about other risks in there. And that's an important migration for boards to start thinking about it that way.
If I could add a data point on that, because I think that's exactly right. I was recently in a meeting with probably 40 CIOs from major global companies, and it was a discussion for about an hour and a half about cybersecurity and how these chief information officers, many of whom have chief information security officers either matrix to them or reporting to them, how they're dealing with this overall problem. And we spent half of that hour and a half talking about their strategies for dealing with the boards on cybersecurity. They said 2 years ago, I would go to the board once a year to talk about IT infrastructure. Now I go to the board 3 times a year, and 2 of those times it's about security. And the other 2 things about that were interesting to me were the range of knowledge in the board is widely varied. So you might have one board member asking about whether or not he should be clicking on some kind of attachment, and another board member with a much more sophisticated understanding of the problem. It was, it was quite interesting in terms of just that element of it, and also what was difficult. The most difficult thing of being in that position was that really it's not that really much fun to be in front of the board and say, we have a big problem and I can't fix it.
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree with everything that's been said. I mean, I think, from our perspective, we've seen the transition to go from, exactly what Ron was saying in terms of, here's a point in time update of what is occurring, to more active engagement of how do we manage this as a risk at every level in the organization, intertwined with every other risk process. And that's probably not just for information security, cyber security, but it also kind of, expands into all forms of operational risk. And, in particular, business resilience, business recovery, many other aspects of operational risk. And, one of the things that I see a lot of firms trying to do, and in fact, we've often got to remember that board members of our own boards serve on the boards of many other companies. In some cases, those companies are not necessarily companies that have, a large financial institutions or, major corporations that have the actual resources to implement what they need to do. And so one of the things we're starting to see is board members as being a place that can educate the whole marketplace. And, we're not only viewing our own board members as people that oversee and direct the risk management apparatus of our environment, but also people that we can work with across our supply chain, across our client base. And so, viewing boards as that interconnected structure for the whole marketplace, I think is going to be increasingly important as well.
Now, Ellen, I can't resist the opportunity, given you have a very senior position as our colleagues do in the industry, would love your perspective on the same question you asked, if you could.
About boards?
Yeah, what you're seeing, how you're dealing with it.
Well, it all rings true, but I'll answer your question by posing another question from which you may infer whatever you will. And maybe I'll direct this back over at you, Phil. You're an information security kind of guy. So when I see this kind of conversation going on in the boardroom, I see 2 problems. And the first one, I think, is captured by actually one of your former colleagues, Bruce, from DHS, who was on a panel with me recently, and where she said, the problem is when these people come in to talk to me about information security, my problem is I don't speak dolphin. I don't understand what they're talking about. So even the more sophisticated people, if you're trying to talk get down to the specifics and explain to them the level of the risk that they're talking about, it becomes very difficult for them to understand. And the reason it's important, and this is the second problem, is that they're kind of in the palm of the information security officer's hand in terms of, I need this money. I need $30 million and I need it now in order to blah, 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 something they don't understand. So, Phil, how do you address that problem?
Yeah, so first of all, just kind of, I'll answer those kind of in reverse. We don't necessarily go to our board for money. There's a whole kind of apparatus of corporate risk management, and really the role of the board is to oversee the effective operation of that wider corporate governance. But the way we kind of, it does take a lot of preparation to talk to any. And it's not just boards, it could be any level of management, not just in your own companies and your own environments, but also in your counterparties, clients, supply chain, is to translate the risk that we see, the consequences that could be felt by that particular business. And then not only to just talk about the control risk and the cost of mitigating that control, but to think about all of the other consequences and impacts, so as we all know, we're all trying to implement certain enterprise objectives, whether it's a mission of a government department or a business objective of a corporation to serve its customers. It's not just about control, it's about enabling those customers, it's about being flexible, it's about being cost effective, and it's about being controlled. And so talking about the balance of those things we've found to be very useful. So, especially when you talk about the interplay between operating risk, security, flexibility, business resilience, because you can often push security down and spike up a resiliency risk. And so talking about the consequences and those frameworks of choice we've found has enabled people to get more engaged rather than just talking about the individual control issues themselves.
I think this is a key point that Phil's making. If somebody is truly feeling that way, that they're getting all this kind of gobbledygook pushed at them, I think you just turn it around like you would any other, what a board member ought to be doing. Don't talk to me in techno speak. The business risk resides with business leaders. You are the leaders. Help us understand, as the governing board, how you're balancing these risks.
I was going to say much the same thing. I'm not sure this is that different, other than its newness, than other technical areas of management and leadership where management needs to translate for the board. I mean, building a well-thought business case, building the justification, and doing the translation in a manner that works in the boardroom.
Right.
Okay, so speaking of cost, this is the one area where it seems like costs keep going up instead of going down. Do you all have that same impression? Is the cost of controlling cyber risk a constantly increasing activity, or is it actually going down?
I think from the way we've seen this, I think the total cost in our experience is going up, but the unit cost of individual things in our experience is going down. And I think in some respects, when we talk about this kind of growing cost, we're failing, it's the classic kind of, we don't really know what the numerator and denominator is in a fair, balanced way. So, if you look at what we spent on control, various types of controls 15 years ago is going to be very different than what we spend today, not just because there's more threats, more issues to deal with, but the risk universe is totally different. So the places we operate, the electronic markets we operate in have grown. There is more complexity in the technology that we deal with and the markets that we operate in. And so, I don't know that, if there was a good way to kind of really equate those numerators, I'm not so sure that things haven't stayed pretty much flat, maybe even a little bit down when you account, but definitely in absolute terms, the cost has gone up, but it's probably not gone up in an unreasonable way, given the new scope of what we have to deal with from from the size of the inherent risk.
Not to want to appear contrarian in any way, but in trying to do some research over the last couple of weeks preparing today, I'm struck that no one out there really has an understanding or clear understanding of what the aggregate cost to society, either in the U.S. or globally, might be here, and to the extent we're evolving more, as we were talking earlier, toward this enterprise-wide approach to managing cyber risk, where costs are embedded throughout an organization. I'm not sure anyone has a clue what portion of this 50 or so trillion of global GDP gets gobbled up here. John, perhaps it would be a fun exercise for EWI to take a look at, to the extent that we are focused on the economic security issues of this nature, but just perspective.
Ron or Bruce, do you have a perspective on the cost question?
You talk about the costs. I would argue that the costs are going up, but that's because if you think about the benefits that we've reaped as a system, right? So two that I can think of just from my narrow perspective in a financial institution is, one, transaction costs have gone down dramatically. As the result of being able to do things electronically, open architecture and all those kinds of things, transaction costs have gone down. And I don't think that we were fully paying for that benefit. Secondly is mobile, right? We mobile everything, right? You can do almost anything at our firm now on the device there that you used to have to, basically do by mail, if not in person. So there's a cost to doing that. And I think that's where we're seeing these costs continue to rise. And one way we could arrest the costs is just say, I'm sorry, we're taking those apps off the net. Or I'm sorry, your transaction costs are actually going to go up, not down. And so far, we've not been willing to do that.
Interesting you bring up the question of the balance between what you're trying to do to appeal to your employee base or to your customer base versus security. And it occurs to me that we often think about security as black and white. There is security or there's not, when in actual fact there's always some blend in between. And you're constantly making that choice, how much to invest in security when it may decrease the number of transactions you can do, when it may turn off your customer base and so forth. Any comments on how you reach that? The loss in economic growth may actually be an opportunity lost versus dollars out the door.
I think that's right. I think one of the problems that hampers the ability to have the conversation at the level which boards are comfortable in the discussion of risk is that we don't have very good metrics yet for how much the next dollar is going to buy in terms of security. And so it's hard to give that cost benefit. And so if boards are trying to think about, well, we'll just absorb the risk and bear it, or we'll try to mitigate it by paying for it, or we'll transfer it through some kind of insurance or transfer it to the customers. All those decisions are helped if you have data, and we don't have that yet. And so and I think that's true in security generally. What is the benefit of an incident avoided? So in general, one ends up trying to calculate, well, what's the worst thing that could happen? And then you go, well, how much? So the damage would be this much if these servers went down for 24 hours. And so then you have to then figure out, okay, well, what are the odds that's going to happen? And then how much would it cost to prevent that? So it's a sort of a what if. You have to back into the rational economics of it. So I think that makes it hard.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question because, often when you hear people ask, how much security is enough, there's never the next sentence, to do what, in what environment, for what business purpose, with what constraints, with what prevailing objective. And I think, we, all of us need to do a service for everybody, and kind of, when somebody says, how much security is enough, you can't just kind of, we have to say what for, in what context. And I think we can kind of create that debate to make sure people are getting more and more specific about exactly what is supposed to be measured for what objective.
And I think as implied in the comments both you gentlemen made, it, from a board perspective, needs to be business case driven, needs to be tailored to the discrete industry sector and organization, taking into consideration the criticality of the assets in the organization, the level of risk to business continuity, to customer retention, to brand management, but business case driven, tailored to the enterprise.
So anybody have any ideas of things that can make security more economical? Are there new technologies, new ways of thinking about security that can make it cheaper to implement?
Well, I think, one of the things, it's come up in, I think we talked about this at the event last year, and it's come up in a number of cases. I don't think there's ever going to be one kind of magic piece of technology that makes all this better. I think it's a function of enterprise design. I think certainly, we have to keep building more defensible and resilient architectures, not just technology architectures, but systemic business architectures. We've got to think about how to be more defensible and how to construct an environment that can be more resilient to these types of threats. And I think sometimes, you just have to step away from kind of, taking any old stuff and then trying to jam control and security over the top of it. One of the things we've been talking about for a number of years is it's kind of it's cliched, I guess, because it's true, is, the desire to have secure products, not just security products, and to really kind of drive down the per unit cost of control by demanding more from the technology we just embed in the environment. And the more we can kind of drive down that per unit cost of control, the more, even still with a growing cost environment, we can scale the control in more places. So I think having more default defensible architectures and moving the old to that new, more defensible environment is certainly the only way we've been able to kind of see the future unfolding in a realistic way.
So it seems to me you're talking about, making the necessary investments to just raise the costs, if you will, to the adversary, and that I think that's absolutely right. I think there's also, I like what you said about enterprise design or whatever. I think there's a question about allocation of costs. So even within firms and organizations, who is bearing it? You, Ron, said that the business owner should be bearing the risks, but if you're a business that has multiple subsidiaries and that kind of thing, I think it's probably pretty hard to allocate the risks when down to the business unit when they may not really experience them, and you may be providing some infrastructure on a wholesale basis across the firm, as opposed to, I know you've been thinking about this.
Yeah, it's back to the point everybody's been making around, this comes from the top because you've got to make big enterprise investments. This is, while you probably could imagine an environment where you can grow some of this bottoms up in a supremely well coordinated way, I think most environments that are choosing to move to a new level of defensiveness are making some pretty, big, bold moves in terms of their enterprise architecture. Again, not just technology, but also business to make themselves more defensible. That does, this risk of stating the obvious, that is going to keep requiring the board and executive management commitment to keep standing behind those investments.
Well, you make a good point there about the top down and the view of it as a large investment from the top down, and yet, supposing we were successful at all of that, it could all go out the window if some employee picks up a thumb drive in the parking lot, right, and attaches it to the wrong computer. Now, I know there's ways to protect that, but we all know that the employees or the customers may end up being the weakest link. So from a business process perspective, Ron, do you have any ideas on that side of the equation?
Well, what you're raising is it's the whole insider threat, and whether it's a malicious threat, is it malfeasance or nonfeasance? But it's the insider threat, and again, I think this comes back to a risk management assessment. One of the reasons that insider threats can be very prevalent is if you have a technology or a business organization that has all those buzzwords that we all look for, nimble, flexible, fast, turns on a dime, well, that's a harder one to protect. So how do you think about how much nimbleness do we need versus, we only want this particular programmer working in this area. We don't care if we're not flexible enough to have him or her working over here. So I keep coming back to that we should always think about this like we think about other big risks to our respective industries, whether we're in the energy industry, financial industry. What are the big risks and how do we manage them? What are the benefits that we're trying to achieve? What are the costs that we're willing to bear? What are the areas where, it just doesn't matter. I don't care what the benefit is here. If it's going to cost us this, be it customer privacy or getting close to the respective crown jewels of our firm, we're not going to, it doesn't matter how much flexibility we want. And I think that's the way to think about these things.
No, I think Ron has great insights there. On your earlier question, there's not a silver bullet. I think maybe just to pile on to your comment, one area that I think can and should receive more attention than I perceive it does in a number of organizations is our overall human capital strategies. Are we bringing in the people with the requisite skills? Or do we have the proper training programs to make everyone in the organization cyber alert and cyber aware? Do we have the proper compliance programs in place? I think a number of the universities have developed some extraordinary programs just in the last several years with strong corporate support for further bolstering human capital capability in the area, although I think we still probably have a bit of a supply and demand disparity there as well. But no silver bullet, but I'd put a lot more focus on our human capital strategies.
So I'd like to switch gears for a moment here. We've been talking a lot about how enterprises can secure themselves or become resilient in cybersecurity, where cybersecurity is a big threat. But I think part of what we heard about this morning is that some of these questions are systemic questions and not things that any individual enterprise can really address. So what are your thoughts on the role of government? What interventions by government would put the incentives in the right place within the broader environment rather than each individual firm seeing itself as a fortress? Bruce?
So I wouldn't go there right away. I wouldn't go there right away to look at government intervention. I think that one of the questions that's pretty, it seems pretty obvious to me, is that it's a larger question of allocation of cost. So as Phil said, the unit cost is going down, and the overall cost may be going up just because of the dependencies and stuff. So I agree with all that. But some of these threats are not. It doesn't make economic sense from an efficiency standpoint for firms to individually protect themselves against each one of these things. It seems to me that there must be, that it's probably going to be more economical if they're handled, say, at a more wholesale level. And for example, some of these intrusion sets and whatnot could be screened by the internet service providers before they get to you. Although there are issues with that. Another area is, can we have stronger, better, more secure software and hardware, so we don't have Patch Tuesday all the time. It's not so many patches and that kind of thing. Again, it's hard to keep it in front of the adversary, so there's all reasons why we haven't done that. But my question really is, before we get the government involved, would be how can firms send a more coherent demand signal that says to the providers, look, we want better stuff. We want more security in our stuff. We are now spending a lot of money on this stuff individually when it's possible if there was the market was more clear in terms of the providers, they would engineer it better, and so everybody's net cost would go down.
And I'd kind of shift the conversation to not to kind of dodge the question about government, but just to expand it. I think, to Bruce's point, I mean, partnership with others is key, right? And one of those partners could be government, not just the government in the country that you happen to be headquartered in, because most companies, most global companies by definition are part of the critical infrastructures of many countries, and many of the threats are non-nation specific threats. And so I think, when we think about partnership, it's partnering with government, it's partnering with other companies in one's own sector, like, for example, the financial services, ISAC, 4,000 members sharing data every day, a great testament to a lot of work from a lot of people, and also in partnership with various governments involved in that. I think the other thing that we're starting to see more of, and, again, communities like this, where we're starting to see partnership across sectors. So, whether it's the finance sector working with the defense industrial-based companies, to share techniques and practices and tradecraft of how to defend things, whether it's even different risk disciplines sharing with each other. So within our company, my team on the technology risk side spend a lot of time working with our compliance surveillance people to think about, is there any commonality between surveilling for a type of financial risk as there is for surveilling for a type of security risk? And so I think, that partnership theme in general to kind of scale beyond our own individual capabilities becomes ever more key. And there's no reason why that partnership can't exist across multiple governments internationally.
Yeah, it's not an either or, and I know you're not saying that, but I think that irrespective of what industry you're in, I think that within the firm you've got three broad obligations. One, you need to protect your own critical infrastructure, whatever that is. It could be, energy, it's your production wells, whatever, but you've got to protect your infrastructure. Second, you've got to, as relevant, protect client information, customer information, privacy, and all that. And then third, you've got to protect your IP, your intellectual property. So that, in my mind, resides with you, and it's on you. the next kind of concentric circle is what Phil was just talking about. And that's developed quite rapidly over the past couple of years. I mean, it's been around for a long time in defense, with the telecom providers, more recently with other industries. And I think that's really important. There's more to be done there. I still don't think that even within financial services, it's viewed as a completely risk-free kind of environment in which you can kind of exchange information. There's always the overhang of a regulator and things like that. And by admitting that X happened is somehow going to bring down a regulator later. We can work on that, but that's really important. The last, if you will, would be governments, whether they're national governments or transnational bodies, where you first we've got to identify almost by industry what are the critical exposures that actually aren't covered by those first two. And it's typically, again, it's on the seams. So in energy, it's the producers, whether they're electricity or otherwise, they've got their stuff protected, but then you've got the grid that's the problem. In financial services, it tends to be markets, right? And it's whether it's the interbank market, the securities markets, where problems there will cause lots of problems elsewhere, and maybe there is a role for government to help in protection there.
Interesting on the supply or the demand side that you mentioned, Bruce, and building off of what you were saying, I reflect that in the payment card industry, we have a kind of a self-regulatory structure of standards that are administered by stakeholders in the payment card industry, data security standard, from all sectors that participate in payments, from merchants to banks to networks. And there was an efficiency there because people used to have to go out and prove to every stakeholder, that they were meeting the standard, but now there's a single standard and a single set of assessors. So there was actually a productivity gain there as well, as you were mentioning. Well, we talked about concentric circles, and we talked about partnership both with each other and with government. How do you think the government partnership is going these days, whether in the narrow sense here in the United States or in the broader sense of the challenge that Phil mentioned of partnering with perhaps hundreds of governments at the same time?
I mean, from our perspective, we think it's going well. I mean, like with anything you could look at, you could always imagine it being better and better and better, but compared to where it was in many countries around the world, we actually find it very good. I mean, it's not just a case of, it's mutual sharing, not just of threat information, but also learning from each other about particular risk mitigation practices. And so, we've definitely found, more cooperation and more structure for cooperation has been appearing, which is good.
My experience in the U.S. certainly would be consistent with that. I do think kind of on the what government can do or not do, there is a broader international challenge that, I hear from a number of multinational corporate entities around the degree of variability in regulatory requirements, compliance requirements, information, across the board. And just when you think you've got it figured out, it changes again. And I think maybe a role we can help play to rationalize and bring a little more consistency. I know certainly when the EastWest Institute moved into the cyberspace, we're interested in helping rationalize across leading countries' approaches there. But I think they're, while agreeing, I think there's some fairly significant challenges just associated with rate of change and inconsistency of requirements.
So do you think the government should be setting security standards?
I certainly don't think so. I think it's premature in some ways, and because the technology is not mature enough for anybody to set security standards at the technology level. The approach that the U.S. is taking right now, which tends to be one of the more voluntary approaches, except for places which are already highly regulated, such as financial services industry, which is less voluntary, is to try to set kind of performance standards in terms of, for critical infrastructure, in terms of how resilient do we need the infrastructure to be. So you might have if you're talking about 911 systems, right, that even after cyber attacks, that you'd be able to still complete 80% of calls to 911 or something like that in a particular emergency. So each of those would have to be tailored to the specific industry and subsector and everything like that. But I think that an approach like that makes more sense than saying, you have to have change your password, every 6 months. And what the framework, which the National Institute of Standards and Technology has been doing, of course, kind of takes that approach and talks about maturity of the organization's security practices rather than specific technologies. But I don't know if we're at the place yet where we need the government mandating a lot of this stuff. I think it's because of the dynamics of the industry. It's tricky for that to be done.
I think there's a role, whether it's for government or even for convocations like this, to really understand what risk looks like out at the tail, because that's really what we're talking about here. I think that there's been a lot of work done and within all firms across all industries in terms of managing the risks that they know of, but it's the risks that we don't know. Right, I mean, just, think about 9/11, right? We had this whole prior 30, 40 years we had a whole protocol in terms of how we thought about aircraft hijackings. In fact, aircraft hijackings went to almost zero. What we thought was happening was an aircraft hijacking, not that the aircraft had been turned into a weapon. So how do we think about the risk at the end of the tails? And that's only going to occur if companies within industries start talking to each other. There's a real and genuine exchange of information and a real understanding of what are we seeing out there? What does that probe look like? It's, what are we seeing? What's the so what are we seeing? And now what are we going to do? And that possibly is a role of government. It's certainly a role of gatherings like this, but in my mind, that's what we have to do. What is what's that black swan actually potentially look like?
Go ahead.
Just to follow up on that, if I may, I think implied challenge there surrounds how does one maintain diligence when really bad things have not happened. Our friend, the late Dr. Sally Ride, was the only person to serve on the 2 shuttle disaster commissions, and she wrote and spoke very eloquently about organizational malaise that can set in over time when really bad things don't happen, even though, in fact, the risk profile increases over time as really bad things don't happen. And I think that has leadership and governance implications. It has human capital implications, but I think really focusing in on how do we maintain that consistent diligence relative to the tail that you're speaking to.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. And as you were speaking, Ron, I was thinking about, the tail events, the black swans that we haven't thought of. But do you all really think that we've got it under control for the things we know about?
Well, certainly you shouldn't interpret my comment to say that we've got it under control, but that there's a lot of good work being done, and I think that that we're making progress. But what I don't believe that we don't know what we don't know, right? And I don't believe that across all firms, I'll go back to the question that you started with, I still don't believe that we've really understood how to put cyber into a risk management framework like we would other risks. So if you're a bank, right? So what do you worry about with a bank? You worry about liquidity, you worry about credit, you worry about all those things like that. Where does cyber fit in that? And how do I think about the distribution of risk there? That's where I think we need to do much more work.
Good point.
So just on that, to take liquidity, for example, you may not be able to model all the sources of potential liquidity problems, right? They could be coming from anywhere, but you do understand how much you need and kind of what you think is going to be the range of effects. And so you build a system that's resilient enough, right, to withstand whatever the source or combination of sources that creates that. So I think, as Phil was talking about earlier, about making these investments and starting to think about things more about resilience, or as much about resilience as about protection, because we will not know what the next really cool way of attacking a system is. So what's the ability of the enterprise to operate in a degraded environment, and for how long, that kind of thing.
And I think the thing to remember is, again, not to diminish the fact that there are some very challenging issues to deal with, and there are some very challenging things to deal with in that tail of risk. There are plenty of basic and effective controls that work every day that in some cases just require some discipline and some enterprise choice. I mean, at the risk of I'm not going to turn this into a technical conversation, but the SANS top 20 controls or the Australian Defence Signals Directorate top 35 controls, it's basically keep your systems up to date. Don't let people wander around with portable drives and USB sticks. Don't let people have administrative rights to install any old software. There's a whole collection of things that defend and defeat many commodity attacks. Now, again, they're not things that necessarily would defeat extremely sophisticated things, in which case you need a layer of other controls. But, one of the things that worries me is some tone in some quarters would have you believe that there's just no way to defend against anything. Certainly if an individual or a company chooses not to manage its environment, it's very difficult to defend that, but you can make a choice to run a disciplined environment that will defend many things, if not, it wouldn't necessarily defend all things, but many things.
I think that's a really interesting comment, and coming from an industry that has many data breaches uncovered every year, and all of them investigated. The reports of the professionals from places like TrustWave and Verizon that do the investigations are that 2/3 and up, sometimes as many as 75% of the breaches in any given year are low to moderate difficulty. So I think there's a lot to be said for, from an economic point of view in controlling this risk, for just doing the basic blocking and tackling that is absolutely not being done in many places today. Probably the overwhelming majority of places have a lot that they could do to improve on that score. I'm going to ask just one more question and then open it up to the audience. So get your questions or comments ready. The last question, and you don't seem to want to talk about government, but I'm going to ask it anyway. So we heard this morning about not only that the government could be helpful, but that the government could be hurtful, either because the nation state itself is coming after a private company, or because our own governments, friendly governments, are attacking someone else and somehow starting a conflict that we're in the middle of. Any observations on what we in the private sector or what governments should be doing differently to reduce that risk?
The only thing I would say is global harmony is good for business, so I'm all for global harmony.
I mean, this is an area, as an institute, we've put a fair amount of focus on coming out of the last two summits. Particularly with regards to risk attendant with non-state actors. I think some of the thoughtful work we've done, recommendations that have been published, would certainly encourage our attendees to there. Certainly the work around protecting critical infrastructure, critical government infrastructure, critical citizen service infrastructure in cyber, I think we've made some nice progress on. We have a ways to go, but do think there's a solid foundation that's come out of the last two summits on that front.
So the only comment I'd make, I agree with those comments. I do think, though, that there's a room for a more concerted voice from the private sector, both business and civil society, to give some feedback to these governments that we do not want the internet to become a war zone. It's a marketplace, it's a schoolyard, it's a playground. Let's try to keep it down to a dull roar, and please kind of curtail your activities. I think that voice has to be heard, and I think that's going to be one of the consequences of the revelations, is that voice will be stronger, but I think it's got to come not just from civil society, but from corporations as well, who may be, as they say in other contexts, collateral damage.
All right, do we have any questions or comments from the crowd there?
Is there any discussions on the financial impact of the presidential directive and the work that NIST has been working on? I was involved in some of that, and it was all voluntary, all guidance document up until they released the notification here a few weeks ago, and they stated in that summary document that it was going to establish the due diligence bar, which doesn't sound voluntary anymore. It sounds like it's a new bar, and there's going to be a lot of expense for a lot of smaller to mid-sized companies. Any thoughts on that?
So, well, I can take a little bit. Yeah, so we've been involved in many of the working groups on the development of the NIST cybersecurity standards, and and on the whole, we think they're they're pretty reasonable, and are a framework that can be applied at different levels according to the nature of your own enterprise. So I think they've, so far at least, they're not finalized, but from what we've seen, they represent a pretty good balance of a whole range of different objectives from many constituencies. I think the interesting thing from our perspective is, they're clearly labeled as voluntary standards, and clearly de jure they're going to be voluntary, but de facto, the way we think about it is they're probably we're going to treat them as if they were mandatory, not least because we think, the parts of, so we examine and risk manage our supply chain. We are part of other people's supply chains. I think that's going to be a very quick proxy for people wanting to seek assurance from each other that they're complying with these things. And so, whether you would perceive it as being voluntary or not, I think most people are going to adopt it because it will become a currency by which people assess each other in their supply chain, from their auditors, potentially from their regulators. It's going to be hard to defend that you don't comply with it when inspected by when inspected by an external party. So, maybe that wouldn't be a bad thing. I don't know.
Well, I think the standard, as you pointed out, is relatively high level. It's certainly not at the same level as SOX, but yeah, I think that's something when it first came out that hadn't been anticipated, that insurance companies, for example, could take this as the standard. Others could just seize on it, and not with detail level testing, but as something that if you don't comply with it could come back to bite you. I think we have a question on table 28 there. Can you wait for the microphone?
Thank you. Suresh Ramasubramanian from MAG. Now, has there been any study on how disrupting the economics of the underground economy that's targeted against you would also help? The economics of defending against a threat and of building defense in depth, and the opportunity cost of how much risk you expect versus how much convenience your users face is a known problem. But there have also been quite a lot of academic studies, such as by Ross Anderson from Cambridge, about the malware economy and how bad actors earn money and where the money flows are. Has there been any work done, as this is mainly a financial services industry panel, in disrupting some of those money flows?
Did you catch that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not getting any kind of detail to respond to that, but I know there's been multiple efforts within the financial sector, both from, disrupting the funding networks through all of the conventional things around anti-money laundering and financing, organized criminal financing, that Department of Treasury and other agencies coordinate. I know, with companies like Microsoft and with the FSISAC, there's been a lot of work to take down botnets and various other issues. So I think there's general, more and more industry coordination, global law enforcement coordination on all of these kind of things.
Other questions?
Over here.
Oh, sorry, number 10.
Greg Austin from the EastWest Institute. This is a joint question between my EU colleagues sitting beside me and me. So in a sense, we've heard an overview of boardrooms a la America, I guess. Be interesting to hear the panel comment on what they understand to be the situation elsewhere. So for example, what does a board in China look like, or a board of a Russian bank look like, and what's the impact, potential impact, flow through for an organization like Goldman Sachs of some really big failure, in some other part of the world, in the cyber domain.
Yeah, I'm happy to take that. I do think you're raising an important point. I think how boards think of it, it's dangerous to generalize, so therefore I will. I think there are different perspectives in different parts of the world. I can't speak to China. I certainly can speak to Europe, where my sense is that there's much more focus on privacy and what and probably a more fulsome analysis of the cost benefit that I was describing earlier than perhaps there has been in the United States. Phil, maybe you can talk about
We
China.
have, of course, a global payment network, and we do interact with banks as well as large retail organizations and processors in many, many different countries in the world. And I would say that the level of awareness, certainly you will find at the executive and board level, would be much higher, generally speaking, in the United States and Europe in our industry, retail banking and payments, primarily because the level of attack has been so much higher and for so much longer than in other places. But I do believe that the issue is very much on the radar screen at the larger institutions throughout the world. And in various other countries, you'll find, for instance, in Japan, there is MIDI. It has their own data security standard that's been in place for a while. So there are other countries which have their own competing and conflicting standards, which when we speak about what's the level for diligence and so forth is going to make things fairly interesting for multinational companies.
I think the way we've observed it around the world is at the risk of grossly oversimplifying, it kind of falls into two camps. Some boards in some countries operate as this is a risk management discipline. Some boards in some other countries operate as a compliance discipline, and that usually seems to be dictated by the prevailing principles versus standards approach to how their overall regulatory framework occurs anyway. And I don't think various people could debate either side of that. I think as long as boards are focusing on the intent, irrespective of whether it's risk or standards based, I think people usually end up in the right place. The only thing that we're just starting to see around the world which I think is a very good thing, is people concluding that the correct thing is to converge things, disciplines like a business resilience with disciplines like technology, cyber, information security risk, to view this as an overall integrated subject of business resilience, and to try and kind of bring some of these silos together, which I think is a correct thing. So we're just, we've been doing this for a long time, and we're just starting to see it be dictated around the world, and I think that's probably a positive development to bring these things together.
Okay, well, I'm being given the time signal, so thank you to our distinguished panelists, and I believe it's time for networking.